Boarding schools was a very harsh, like, and brutal and sad part of history that doesn't really get like taught in school, like how it should be. But like there is a lot of like ethnic erasure, erasing like the actual native language of the actual original inhabitants of that land. And we also got rebranded as that as the boarding schools went on, and we actually got our spiritualities erased and our way of life erased. And that's why we have like names that are not ours. That's why we, like me, I have a Spanish name, and that's not my actual name because that is a Spaniard name, and that name came from Spaniard because we got rebranded to be Mexican and have Spanish names, and that went with to the natives in the Americas and in Canada. Our actual like names erased, and we were forced to speak English or we were forced to speak Spanish. That's called forced assimilation into a way of life that's not even ours, and like a spirituality that's not even ours, and religion that we shouldn't even be practicing on. That was whenever we had our like actual names erased, our native language erased, and our actual way of life erased, and we were spiritually abused. It was abusive, and it was racism and forced assimilating and raping and also lynching and enslaving as well. It wasn't just religion when it came to this. Religion was part of boarding schools too. So that's why I don't really support like anything like now. Once you understand like history and you see it for what it is and you realize that your ancestors were part of that, you really start to question like a lot when it comes to like your actual true ethnicity and true roots. Because my name is actually not supposed to be Spaniard because my name is Spanish. So my name is not actually supposed to be Spaniard, but because of boarding schools and all that stuff, we got rebranded and our names rewritten and forced to speak a language that's not even ours, a language that belongs on the other continent. Some people, some of us think that we're Mexican, and some of them barely understood that we were not Mexican and that Mexican is only a country and a nationality. Yes, big identity crisis for me as well. But when people understand that they're actually native indigenous, they get a big identity crisis as well. It'd be better to like understand like your true roots than to just rely on a nationality that any other race can claim, because that's not our ethnicity roots. Our ethnicity roots is way different than the nationality roots, but this is about boarding schools. That was like the peak of our like our native indigenous languages and like our way of life. Like whenever we got like the whole native indigenous like image erased. Like since we got rebranded to be like Mexican, or some people got rebranded to be English, like we kind of like forgot like our like who we were. And that causes like ancestral trauma that a lot of us suffer today. We also have ancestral trauma and modern day trauma. And we also have trauma within ourselves. So that causes a big like culture mental breakdown, but we normalize it to a point where we just look at that as like, oh, that's a personality and that's how they are by ancestral culture. So that's why I'm like, okay, no, first of all, our ancestors were in boarding schools and we got our actual names erased and to rebrand to be Spanish and for all of us to be Mexican when any other race can be Mexican too. So it doesn't make sense if we identify as Mexican and the other race ethnicity person is identifying as Mexican as well. It causes confusion when it comes to like your actual ethnic roots, and like confusion to the fact of like what's your actual roots or like your nationality. Nationality culture is not that important than your ethnicity roots, but the way we put it on a pedestal, our nationality culture, we actually identify as that more than our actual ethnicity roots. That's why we all like kind of forgot like our actual ancestral like roots. We now think that we're Mexican because we got rebranded. Our ancestors got rebranded after being raped, lynched, enslaved, and like forced assimilating and abused, and rebranded into a different way of life and rebranded into like different names. Like they're completely even confused about their own like image and actual ethnicity roots and actual real names and history too, because it was taught in school. Schools have definitely re-imaged and rebranded us, but in a way that our ancestors didn't want, but in the way that we normalize it today. So yeah, that's why boarding schools was like the very last like time we really like all of us like identified as like native indigenous to speak our native language and to identify being native indigenous. That was like our peak of identifying as like native indigenous and having our native indigenous languages and having our native indigenous like way of life. That was like the peak of those boarding schools, because after the boarding schools we got rebranded. We had our names to be Spaniard or English. That's why we were all completely like confused about like history, and that we label a certain ethnicity be a certain way, or a certain nationality or a certain ethnicity, without knowing the context of why we identify as that. To be like Mexican, for example, like whenever we went like last year, like I would just look at a brown person and be like, that person is Mexican. But no, any other ethnicity can be Mexican, and Mexican's only a country and a nationality. When you understand history, you'll be like, oh, that dude is the original inhabitant. He's native indigenous. Instead of being like, oh, he's Mexican. Because that's a nationality. And that's what I say, like, we identify more into a nationality rather than our ethnicity, not knowing that other ethnicities can be that nationality as well in that culture. But if it was the ethnic roots and ethnic culture, no other ethnicity can be that. So yeah, boarding schools was a very harsh time period. Yeah, it was just a bad time for our ancestors. And yeah, to keep the ethnic roots alive is to let people like understand the history of like boarding schools. So yeah, our ancestors suffered a lot. Boarding school era was like the time where like we like everything was erased of our culture and way of life. And that's why through the years we just are completely confused, and we rely on the nationality culture rather than ethnicity roots really are. So yeah, boarding schools was a harsh, bad time, and I think we should decolonize from all that, because the more we feed into our nationality culture, the more that we are just completely ambiguous to our actual culture. Boarding schools was like the last time all of us, we even knew or like understood what native indigenous really was to our bloodline and ethnicity roots. So yeah, decolonize from the boarding school and ancestral trauma if you want to. Boarding schools, decolonize from boarding schools.